Then the second question is how can a non-African language speaking lecturer facilitate translanguaging in class? So again, this depends really on how one understands the role, the language, the nature of language, and so on. So here, of course, to me, it's not really a question of language here. That is the question of pedagogy, where, for example, I mean, students are encouraged to make meaning on their own, where students are encouraged to construct knowledge rather than being instructed. That is rather than instructionism, where the lecturer is at the center, is the one with the source of knowledge. So, but where you adopt a pedagogy that encourage inquiry learning, that learners learn on their own. So even when you are using a pedagogy like a translanguaging, again, it doesn't mean that this must be teacher centered or lecturer centered. This kind of pedagogy works well where learners are allowed to make meaning. That is learner-centered approach, where students or learners are allowed to make meaning on their own. So in this case now, the lecturer is not at the center stage. The pedagogy here is that the lecturer is just it's just a facilitator. It's a facilitator assisting learners to learn in the space. So what the role of the lecturer there, if it's a non-speaker of the language, the lecturer must open translanguaging space. What is called translanguaging space. And then now students themselves, even sometimes where this translanguaging space is not created, students themselves take their own initiative, to open up those spaces for themselves. In one of my projects that I conducted when I was still at the University of Cape Town, in maths tutorials, maths whiteboard project, it was fascinating to see how students are able to to learn to discuss maths on their own, even though the lecturer could not really understand or speak any of the other languages. But the lecturer was confident that as long as students are making meaning, and then he would just look at the sums, what they are talking about, what they are writing about, solving solutions, and that was enough. The students on their own will be able to find the solutions to the problems given to them. And sometimes students also monitor themselves. Where they do not understand, they will approach the lecturer and ask for solution. So it doesn't necessarily mean that one has to be a multilingual speaker to be able to facilitate translanguaging pedagogy. Anyone can facilitate as long as you know how this kind of pedagogy works.
I'm going to phrase the second question a little more broadly because it's something that I have to deal with as well here in the United States. Although most of my students are not native speakers of African languages, they speak Spanish, Bangla, some actually do speak African languages. So, how can lecturers promote translanguaging when they don't speak their students' first language? Well, I think the most important thing is to make sure lecturers do not feel threatened by the language that they don't understand. Over the years, I witnessed many situations where my colleagues said to my students, you're speaking in your own language, you're thinking in your language, you're doing something bad. And I know that my colleagues meant well, but those comments can be very damaging. Let's try to understand that when we're trying to complete an academic task, any kind of task, we use whatever language we have at our disposal. And if a student thinks in another language, speaks in another language, it's because he or she hasn't gotten to a point where they can complete the task using exclusively one language. Secondly, I think it's important for the lecturers to have a conversation with the students about language practices at the beginning of the course and say to them, it's okay to use a language that I don't understand. It's okay for you to translanguage, to combine your languages, because most students will not understand what the word translanguaging means. But there's a time and place for everything. There are certain boundaries. So I personally believe that translanguaging works best as a scaffolding tool, and I know that a lot of people would disagree with me. But I also believe that there are times when translanguaging is not such a good idea. For example, when you have a multilingual classroom, like the ones that I have in the Bronx most of the time, sometimes you have students who speak 7 or 8 different languages, and it's not polite for some students to use a language in certain situations when other students might not understand. Secondly, I think it's also important to be very clear around the idea that conversations in any language in a classroom ought to be content focused. In other words, people should not use other languages to talk about the weather or make plans for the weekend, but rather to try to grasp the content that the lecturer is helping students learn. Oh yes, and the most important thing, the thing that is closest to my heart, I really believe that it's very, very important for the lecturers to make an effort to learn their students' first language. I wrote a book about this, and I'm not saying that a lecturer should become proficient in every single language that's spoken in the classroom. That would be wonderful if it could happen, but in reality, it cannot. But my experience and my research has shown that even making the effort to learn a few words in languages that tend to be excluded from the classroom can go very, very far in creating this emotional, safe climate where students can take risks with their second language or their third language. And it can also very far in promoting classroom engagement. I was going to project a slide, but as I said before, I'm not very familiar with this medium, but I'm just going to summarize what one of my students said to me about the fact that I made the effort to learn Spanish in English as a second language class that was designed for Spanish speakers. She said to me that it's wonderful when your professor makes an effort to learn your language because it tells you that the professor understands who you are and the professor understands that everything about you is important. In more theoretical terms, I would say that making an effort to learn from our students, especially their language, brings about a shift from coercive to collaborative power relations. In other words, power is no longer imposed by someone who's in a position of authority, like a professor or a lecturer, but it's actually constructed together as you make the effort to use more than one language. And the professor becomes a learner too and gets off the pedestal sometimes as students are learning. That can be very, very healthy.
A short definition of translanguaging is that it is a language-specific instruction, but not full mastery of two or more individual separate languages. The presentation aligns with Garcia and Flor's pedagogical principles of attention to social justice and attention to social practice. But the starting point for lecturers should be to re-envision classrooms as translanguaging spaces, spaces for translanguaging created by translanguaging. The following multilingual practices in instruction are vital for especially lecturers who find themselves in a multilingual classroom. During instruction, lecturers must be conscious about the following. Number one, that it is the purpose of translanguaging to integrate language and content in teaching, so as to allow students an understanding of field-specific concepts in their languages, allow them to interact, to negotiate the meaning of concepts in their languages. The output and input in the lesson should deliberately be in different languages, and they can work in groups. Number two, to promote interpersonal interactions and inclusion, drawing upon what students know individually and collectively, meaning that the lesson presentations should encourage collaboration by students using their languages. And this could be helpful to both the lecturer and the students, as they can actively leverage their linguistic repertoires for the benefit of using them as resources to access knowledge. Oral discussions by students be conducted in their languages, even the writing of passages to express themselves in their languages, including the development of projects and experiments. Number three, student-centeredness, which means that the lesson should be developed around the students with the intention to let them be actively engaged in the teaching and learning of the content by using their languages. To achieve all these, it will be helpful to non-African languages lecturers to have with them side by side lecturer assistants who master the subject and good command of students' language.